I worked 31 years for the same company and never once asked for anything I hadn't earned. That's the kind of man my father raised me to be. You show up, you do the work, you keep your mouth shut when things are hard, and you trust that the people who matter will see you clearly. My wife saw me clearly. Or at least, I believed that for a long time. Her name is Vanessa. She was 26 when we met, working the front desk at an architecture firm where I was bidding a renovation contract. She had this way of paying attention to whoever was talking to her, completely, like nothing else existed. I thought it was just her personality. Later, I'd realize it was a skill, one she'd refined, one she deployed strategically. We got married when she was 29. I was 41. Yes, the gap was there. Her mother mentioned it at the rehearsal dinner with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. My brother-in-law made a joke. I laughed it off. Vanessa squeezed my hand under the table and said, "Don't listen to them." I didn't. The first 6 years were good. Genuinely good. We bought a house in Raleigh, nothing extravagant. 4 bedrooms, a yard the dog could actually use. I ran my contracting business. She moved from firm to firm, climbing steadily, and I was proud of her. When she told me she'd been offered a director of business development position at Caldwell & Marshex, one of the top 5 commercial real estate firms in the state, I took her out to dinner and ordered the expensive wine. She deserved it. That's when things started to shift, though I didn't recognize it at the time. The hours got longer. That made sense. A new role. Proving herself. The travel got more frequent. That also made sense. She started talking about her managing director, a man named, well, she called him Greg at first. Casually, the way you'd mention a colleague. Greg thinks the Henderson pitch needs more visuals. Greg says the Charlotte office is behind on projections. Greg this, Greg that. I didn't think much of it. I'm not a jealous man by nature. I've always thought jealousy was mostly about insecurity, and I didn't have much of that. I should have paid closer attention to what I was actually hearing. The first moment I can point to, the first real moment, was a Wednesday in October. I remember it was Wednesday because I'd just finished a job in Durham and come home early, maybe 3 in the afternoon. The house was quiet. The dog was at the groomer. Vanessa wasn't supposed to be home until 7. I walked through to the kitchen to get some water, and her laptop was open on the counter. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me. I wasn't looking for anything. I just happened to glance at the screen as I passed. It was a text conversation, mirrored to her laptop through some app she used to keep her messages in sync. I saw 2 lines before I looked away. "Miss you already." Same. "Be careful driving home." The name at the top of the thread was Greg M. I stood there for a moment, put my glass down, picked it up again, walked out to the back porch and sat with the dog when she got home an hour later and didn't say a word. I told myself there were a dozen explanations. I told myself I hadn't seen enough to conclude anything. I told myself I was probably wrong, but something had changed in my chest. Something quiet and cold had moved in. The way cold air moves in under a door, before you even notice the temperature dropping. I started paying attention differently after that, not obsessively. I want to be clear about that too. I didn't download spyware or hire someone. I just watched. The way a man watches when he already suspects something but hopes to be wrong. She'd come home from trips and something about her energy was different, not happier, exactly, or contained, like she was holding something back behind her eyes. She stopped reaching for my hand. Small things. Invisible things, almost. The kind of thing that only registers when you've been with someone long enough to know their baseline. February came. She flew to Chicago for a conference. I drove to visit my brother in Greensboro for the weekend, which is what I'd planned. Saturday evening, I got a notification from our home security app. Someone had opened the back door. I pulled up the camera feed from my phone, thinking maybe a neighbor had stopped by to grab something. It was Vanessa. She wasn't supposed to be back until Sunday. She wasn't alone. The camera angle caught them in the kitchen for maybe 40 seconds before he followed her down the hall. I sat in my brother's driveway staring at my phone. My brother came out to see what was taking me so long, and I told him I'd gotten a work call. I followed him inside. I ate dinner. I watched a game. I didn't sleep. Sunday morning, I drove home. Vanessa was there, back from Chicago, she said. "Look rested," she said. "Look rested," she said. "Great conference." I said, "Glad to hear it," and poured myself a coffee. I didn't say anything about what I'd seen. Not then. I know that probably sounds strange. Most men, I think, would have confronted her right there, maybe thrown him out, maybe thrown her out, maybe made the kind of scene that would have been entirely justified. I thought about it. I sat with it for a long time, weeks, actually. And what kept me from reacting immediately was something my father used to say: don't make the move that feels good. Make the move that works. So I made an appointment with a divorce attorney on a Monday morning in March without telling anyone. Her name was Patricia. Wait, I need a different name. She went by Adele, and she'd been doing family law for 22 years. She sat across from me with her hands folded on the desk and listened while I told her everything. When I finished, she said, "Have you documented any of this?" I said, "I have the security footage." She said, "That's a start. Get more." That was the beginning of what I came to think of as my second job. During the day, I managed my crews, filed permits, drove sites. In the evenings, for about 6 weeks, I built a file. I documented the footage. I noted dates, times, discrepancies between her stated travel schedule and what I could verify. I went back through our joint accounts. She handled most of her work expenses on a corporate card, but there were gaps, cash withdrawals on weekends when I thought she was somewhere else. I didn't touch anything. I didn't move money. I didn't tip her off. What I did do, quietly, was talk to my accountant about our business assets and how they'd been structured going back to the beginning. My business, which I'd started before we married, had always been kept largely separate. My accountant had set it up that way from the beginning, for liability reasons more than anything. That turned out to be one of the most important facts in what came next. Adele and I had 3 meetings. By the end of the third, she looked at everything I'd brought and said, "You're in a better position than most men who sit in that chair." I told her I wasn't interested in being in a better position. I was interested in being done cleanly and in not being made a fool of in the process. She said, "Then let me work." April turned into May. Vanessa and I went on living the surface of our life together. We had dinner. We watched television. She talked about a new account she was chasing. I asked questions and listened and responded appropriately. At night, I lay beside her in the dark and wondered if she had any idea what was sitting in a folder on my attorney's computer. I didn't think she did. She was relaxed, almost cheerful in a way she hadn't been for a while. The cheerfulness, I eventually understood, was not because things were good with us. It was because things were going well with him. The conversation I'd been dreading came on a Thursday evening in late May. I'd had a long day, dust in my hair, still in my work boots. She was sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of wine, and something about her posture was different, deliberate. "Set," she said, "we need to talk." I sat down across from her. I said, "All right." She said she'd been unhappy for a long time, that we'd grown apart, that she tried to ignore it but couldn't anymore. She said she wanted a divorce. She said it evenly. No anger, no tears, just clean. The way you'd deliver a business decision you've already finalized in your own mind. And then she smiled. It wasn't a mean smile exactly. It was the smile of someone who believes they're holding all the cards. Someone who has already pictured how this plays out. And in their version, they come out ahead. I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Okay." She blinked. That wasn't the response she'd prepared for. I said, "I'll contact my attorney this week." She said, "You already have an attorney?" I said, "I've had one since March." The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then she said, carefully, "Why March?" I said, "Because I'm not an idiot, Vanessa. I just don't always show what I know." She started to say something, and I held up one hand. Not aggressively, just to stop the conversation. And I said, "We don't have to do this tonight. Let Ad office and your attorney talk. That's what they're for." I went upstairs. I showered. I went to bed. She didn't come up for 2 hours. What happened next is where most people's version of this story would turn into a fight. Recriminations. Accusations. Her telling me I was cold. That I never really understood her. That she deserved more. And maybe some of that did get said. In the weeks that followed, in various conversations I mostly tried to keep short. But the actual process, the legal process, was not what she expected. She had assumed, I think, that she would be the one in a stronger position. She made significantly more than I did. She had a corporate network, connections, a reputation in her industry. She had pictured, I imagine, some version of this where I was caught off guard and scrambling. What she hadn't pictured was that my business had been legally structured as a separate asset from the beginning of our marriage. What she hadn't pictured was that the home equity was more complicated than she'd assumed. There were funds that came from my father's estate that Adele had documented carefully. What she hadn't pictured was that I had 6 weeks of documentation, including security footage, that changed the nature of the conversation about fault in a state where that still matters. And what she absolutely had not pictured, I don't think, was that I hadn't been emotionally unprepared. That's the part that seemed to actually unsettle her. Not the legal details. The fact that I'd already grieved quietly over the preceding months. That I'd already done the hardest work alone in the dark before she ever sat down at that kitchen island with her glass of wine. She came to the conversation expecting to devastate someone. She found someone who had already rebuilt. Her attorney made initial demands that Adele described to me as ambitious. I said, "Tell me when it's something realistic." It took 3 rounds of negotiation over about 6 weeks. What we settled on was fair. Not favorable to me in some dramatic sense, but fair. She kept her retirement accounts. I kept my business structure intact. The house was sold and divided. Clean. She asked, through her attorney at one point, whether I wanted any acknowledgement. I didn't know exactly what that meant, and I asked Adele to clarify. Adele came back and said, "She wants to know if you need her to say she's sorry." I thought about that for a day. Then I told Adele to tell her it wasn't necessary. Because here's the thing I figured out during those long months of watching and waiting and building a file and lying in the dark beside someone who'd already checked out of our marriage. An apology wouldn't have given me anything I needed. It would have been for her, not for me. A way for her to feel like the ending had been handled with some grace, some dignity on her part. She didn't get to have that from me. Not because I was punishing her, but because I genuinely didn't need to give it. I was already past it. I finalized the divorce on a Tuesday morning in early September. It was raining. I signed the papers at Adele's office, shook her hand, drove through a Bojangles on the way home, and sat in my truck in the parking lot eating a biscuit. And for the first time in probably 14 months, I felt like I could breathe all the way to the bottom of my lungs. My brother called that evening. I told him it was done. He asked if I was okay. I said I was, and meant it, which I think surprised him. He said, "I always thought you were too quiet about the whole thing." I said, "I know. That's kind of why it worked." There are things I didn't find out until later, through mutual friends who apparently felt I deserved to know. The man she'd been involved with, Greg, had been simultaneously involved with another woman in the Chicago office. By the time Vanessa's divorce was finalized, he was already navigating his own complications. A relationship that had, at least in part, unraveled our marriage didn't hold together much longer past mine. I don't know exactly what she felt about that. I hope she found something real eventually. I mean that without sarcasm. She is not a villain in some larger story. She's just a person who made choices I couldn't live with, and I don't need her to have been destroyed by the consequences to feel settled in my own. The dog is with me. Our name is Biscuit, which my wife always thought was undignified for a dog. I've always thought it fit her perfectly. I still run the same business. I have 11 employees now, up from 8 when all this happened. I bought a smaller house, a 3-bedroom about 12 minutes from the old one. And I've spent the last year doing the kind of work on it that I never had time for when I was managing the surface of a marriage that had already ended. New floors in the kitchen, a deck out back. I don't talk about what happened very often. The men in my family are not talkers by tradition, and I've mostly carried this the same way. But I'll tell you what I tell anyone who asks me directly. Silence is not the same as weakness. Watching is not the same as blindness. And the most powerful thing you can sometimes do when someone has decided to underestimate you is to let them keep believing they're right up until the moment when it no longer serves you to. She handed me a divorce with a smile on her face. I signed it with one too. The difference was, mine came from knowing exactly how the story ended. I've thought a lot about why Vanessa smiled when she handed me those papers. I don't think it was cruelty exactly. I think it was certainty. She had built a picture in her mind of how that evening would go. The shock on my face, the stumbling, the scrambling, and that picture had made her feel safe, confident, like the outcome was already written. What she didn't account for was that I'd had months to write my own version. That's the thing about choices. They don't just affect the moment you make them. They ripple. Every decision Vanessa made, to pursue something she knew was wrong, to come home early that February with someone who wasn't her husband, to smile at a kitchen island like she'd already won. Each one of those choices moved something into place. Not as punishment from somewhere outside herself, just as consequence. The natural weight of what a person sets in motion. And my choices move things into place too. The choice to watch instead of react, to document instead of accuse, to sit with my brother on a Saturday night and eat dinner like nothing had happened, while something in me was quietly rebuilding. Those choices cost me something. The sleepless nights, the months of lying beside someone and knowing what I knew, but they also gave me something. They gave me the ending I needed rather than the one she'd scripted for me. I'm not a man who thinks in terms of fate or cosmic balance or anything like that. I grew up practical. My father was practical. What I believe in is this: character compounds. The choices you make quietly, when no one is watching and nothing is forcing you, those are the ones that actually define what you're capable of. Vanessa had been making choices in the dark for a long time. So had I. The difference was what we were building. Adele told me once, toward the end of the process, that most of her clients come in already broken, reactive, emotional, making decisions from the worst version of themselves. She said I was different. I told her I'd just had a head start on the grief, but I've thought about that since, and I think it was more than that. The months of patience weren't just strategy. They were a kind of discipline. A decision to let my better judgment run things instead of my worst impulses. That's harder than it sounds. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What I'd tell anyone in going through something like this, not as advice, just as something I learned, is that your response to being wronged is the one thing still entirely yours. Vanessa took a lot from our marriage, but she couldn't take my clarity. She couldn't take the fact that I kept my business clean, kept my finances honest, kept my word to people who depended on me through all of it. Those things were still standing when everything else came down. The dog is still here. The business is still running. The new deck is finished, and I signed those papers with a steadier hand than she expected. That's enough for me.